but none of them create jobs. None of them reduce waiting times at our NHS, and none of them improve our education system. And as we've pointed out in this podcast before, that is the people's priorities right now. And I don't think the Scottish Government are getting the right balance in terms of how they focus their efforts.
Christina says, I'm genuinely left wondering if the Scottish Government had a bet on, as they returned from the Holyrood recess, to see how many Scottish voters, journalists and opposition MSPs they could really annoy in one day on a range of issues. The SNP and the Scottish Green government looks and sounds so out of touch. So there's a bit of an umbrella thought there for you. Then Peter says, the CASS review, the Scottish response, what it is, what it could and should be. Joanna Cherry's been vocal about this online, and Peter points to that reference to Joanna Cherry's Scottish exceptionalism post, which is very interesting for several reasons. I'll come back to that in a second. Joe says, Scottish Government's woeful response to the CASS review. Why the exceptionalism? See Joanna Cherry's remarks. And why the unshakable adherence to Stonewall from Humza Yousaf. Cynthia says, the CASS review and why the Scottish Government and other politicians are so reluctant to comment. Will they adopt its findings or commission their own review to delay it further? Andrew McCall says, hold the Scottish Government to account for avoiding the obvious conclusion of the CASS report, the ceasing of medicating children with puberty blockers at the Sandiford Clinic in Glasgow, and the fact they're putting no one forward to discuss this. Cowards. So there is an overwhelming feeling in all of this, Geoff, in terms of where are the Scottish Government? We want to hear from them. We want them to answer on this important issue of the day. And Humza Yousaf has been kind of asked about it a bit, and the Scottish Government have said, this is from Gina Davison at LBC, that they're still considering the recommendations, but no clarity on who will decide whether they're implemented, and no timescale. But there will be no kind of Scottish report likely, and patients will be told of any changes first. But, I mean, you see from the replies from our followers on Twitter, people are looking for a response, they're looking for information.
They are indeed. I'm going to let Andy come back to the specifics of the CASS review because he made a very prescient point last week on this. But I want to place it into some context. You know, there are good things going on from the Scottish Government just now in response to the first question you read out there. The child disability payment, increased coverage reaching 47,000 additional kids. That was announced last week. Just this morning we've had a memorandum of understanding between Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Hyundai about investment in floating offshore wind, which rather ties into what we were just saying about the importance of rural communities. And there is a commitment from those on the Scottish Government delegation to the most recent COP conference to have exports of over £78 million. These are good announcements. They're good things, both covering social policy and indeed business, and commerce, and job creation. But they're getting completely shrouded out by a number of the issues that have been raised in our questions so far. We've had 3 weeks almost of constant discussion over the hate crime legislation. Now, whatever your views on that, I'm always reminded of the Ronald Reagan phrase that if you're explaining, you're losing. So pretty clearly, the Scottish Government is losing on this particular debate because all they're doing is trying to explain what it is and what it isn't, and that's never a good place to be in politics. Next week we've got jury list trials coming up at the Parliament. That's hugely contentious. Almost the entire legal fraternity are opposed to this pilot, and indeed already the Scottish Government seem to be rowing back this morning on that. We've got this CASS review that the Scottish Government have not responded to. In comparison, the Labour Party came out 30 minutes after it was announced and offered their view. Now, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, that view. The point is that we're still waiting for the Scottish Government's response, and that's going to be ever more press-worthy, whatever they say, and hugely controversial, no doubt. We've got a misogyny bill that the Scottish Government is going to put forward later on in the year in the context of potentially a general election. And then we've got conversion therapy as well upcoming. Now, all of these issues, no doubt, are very noble and important, but none of them create jobs. None of them reduce waiting times at our NHS, and none of them improve our education system. And as we've pointed out in this podcast before, that is the people's priorities right now. And I don't think the Scottish Government are getting the right balance in terms of how they focus their efforts.
I mean, I think that Geoff's put that really well there. This ultimately is about messaging, and you've got to look at what people want their government to focus on. It's perfectly obvious. Every single poll that is conducted will tell you that the two most important priorities for people, and it's both in Scotland and England, but the two most important priorities by a long, long way are healthcare and the economy. Those are the two things that people understand are needing a lot of care and attention. Those are the two things that people want the government to focus their care and attention on. And at the moment, that's not happening. It's not happening at Scottish Government level. It's also not happening at UK Government level either, it has to be said. This is not just an issue for the Scottish Government. It's not happening at either level. But the difficulty is that when a government then starts to focus its own priorities on issues that are not the priorities of the people, but at the same time, it wouldn't be so bad if they were actually then aligned with the views of the people, even though they weren't the priorities. But when they're not the priorities of the people, and they're unaligned with the views of the people, which is exactly what the case is in a lot of the gender recognition stuff, then you've really got a problem, because you start to really upset people, you start to concern people, people start to wonder what on earth is going on. And that undoubtedly, to come back to the first part of the question that listeners have been asking us to talk about this week, is the case with CASS and the gender identity services at Tavistock. This is not a marginal issue in the eyes of most people. This is a very, very clear-cut issue. And the difficulty for the Scottish Government is, A, that they're not saying anything, although Humza Yousaf was on the radio yesterday saying nothing definitive, but at least answering a question on it. The difficulty with the Scottish Government not saying anything yet definitive is that people start to ask why. And the difficulty with people starting to ask why is you get to the point where all roads lead to the coalition agreement and the Green Party. And that is difficult externally with voters, and it's difficult internally with some of the more sceptical members of the SNP when it comes to the coalition with the Greens. We know the Green Party is opposed to CASS because they came straight out and said it. So we know they don't want the recommendations of CASS implemented in Scotland. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors about how it doesn't apply to Scotland because it applies to services in England, but a 13-year-old girl in England to me is the same as a 13-year-old girl in Scotland, so I think it's nonsensical to say that the same conclusions don't apply when effectively the same things are being done. And it all leads to the question of not only is the Scottish Government going to respond, but why is the Scottish Government not responding? And is this actually about the coalition agreement with the Greens? Until we know it's not about that, it's quite difficult to get away from the conclusion that that is not playing a role in the Scottish Government's thinking and decision-making.
Just to sort of tidy this up with a couple of other thoughts then. So politically, the Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Megan Gallagher, who's been on this podcast, she raised the CASS report and the refusal of the Scottish Government to make a statement on this in the Chamber. She says the Scottish Government must implement the recommendations or explain why they won't, and says a request for an urgent question yesterday, this was Tuesday, was also refused. And there were also reports that the Alba MSP, Ash Regan, also lodged a topical question and an urgent question on the CASS report, and in the similar manner, they were rejected as well. So the politicians are sort of trying to get something of a response. We will also try to get something of a response for you on this podcast as well. Perhaps that will come by next week, who knows. A couple of you mentioned Joanna Cherry's tweets on this, so let me just read these to you. She posted this thread on the 16th of April. Politicians from all parties calling for a separate Scottish review after the CASS report are guilty of the most fatuous Scottish exceptionalism. Just how do they suppose it would improve upon this detailed years-long process led by a senior clinician? No doubt some hope to pack a Scottish review with the very agenda-led, inexpert lobbyists who are responsible for the existing mess. I really hope there will be MSPs with the sense and courage to challenge this nonsense and follow the CASS recommendations. If CASS is not implemented in Scotland, then children will continue to be harmed and we will end up with expensive medical negligence suits with damages paid out by the public purse. Our NHS really can't afford that. Wise up. So yeah, we'll definitely keep an eye on the CASS report, the CASS review, and the implications for Scotland as and when they become clear. Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, Open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.